Chelsea Paggio. I'm the Assistant Director of Alumni Relations for Point Loma Nazarene University. We're really excited to have Callie with us here today. We've been hosting this series of Loma Talks, and our Loma Talks, this series has been an exciting opportunity for us to engage virtually with our community. And we've had a lot of really great opportunities just to engage in conversation. And so Callie Stevens is here with us today. She's an alum from 2014, and she is going to be sharing with us about her work with Nazarene Compassionate Ministries, and talk a little bit about how Point Loma's partnered in the past, also kind of the work that she's doing with them now and how that has pivoted because of COVID-19. I know a lot of us have been impacted by that, and so she's going to share with some of the things they're doing for the communities worldwide. So without further ado, I think we're going to get started. I'm going to invite Callie. If you do have any questions for Callie during this time, we invite you to just put those questions into the chat box. And we'll be having a Q&A time with Callie as well. Yeah, with that being said, I think we're gonna pass it to Callie and welcome her. So thanks so much.
Great, thanks, Chelsea. So Chelsea asked me to talk a little bit about my Point Loma experience. But first, as she said, I'm Callie Stevens. Graduated 2014, and I work at Nazarene Compassionate Ministries, which is what we're going to talk a little bit about today. So I'll get into what NCM does in just a little bit, but first I'll talk a little bit about my Point Loma experience. So one of, I think, the funniest parts of my story is that I came into Point Loma undecided, but declared myself as a writing major halfway through the year. And the reason that's funny is because I've been writing stories since I was a little kid. So I'm not sure what I was undecided about for that first half, but I'm glad that I eventually found my way into the writing department. So doing writing in general opened the door to participating in both journalism and creative writing, whereas you know, if I'd done just journalism, I wouldn't have maybe gotten to do as much of the creative side. But the journalism side meant that I got to be the editor, one of the editors, not the main editor, of the Point Weekly my junior year. I was the features editor. And that's also a funny part, because at the time I said that I remember saying specifically, I never want to be in a job where I'm responsible for making people write stories for me. So I'm an editor of a magazine, so that's my whole job now. But I think that what I learned in that position, and working with people and learning how to encourage them to find stories and see stories in, you know, everyday, all sorts of different everyday scenarios has helped so much in this job, and just learning, because it definitely is a skill, like what is a story, what isn't a story. So Point Loma really helped me hone that skill. And then I also got to just work with my professors so much to help develop my writing in so many ways. And they taught me so much about not self-editing as I go, particularly through an honors project that I did my senior year. And that honors project and the writer's voice that I was able to find through that with the help of my professors is undoubtedly what got me my first internship. And then my first internship led to a position at World Vision, and then also to my current role at Nazarene Compassionate Ministries. So it's kind of neat to look back and trace that line from when I was an 18-year-old who wasn't sure that I even wanted to do writing to, you know, going through Point Loma and having those office chats with my professors, and, you know, stressing on Sunday night that we weren't going to be able to have a features section in the Point Weekly. There's a very clear line from those experiences to where I am now. So it's neat to look back at how Point Loma really influenced that. So when I got to the end of college, I I had also participated throughout college in different social justice initiatives, different student ministries, and I was really trying to find a way to combine a passion for humanitarian work with writing. So that first internship that I mentioned was at a local San Diego nonprofit called Plant with Purpose that some of you are probably familiar with. And that kind of gave me a glimpse into that nonprofit world. So then after graduating, I moved to Los Angeles and eventually ended up at World Vision in another internship. And it actually wasn't writing in that internship. It was an executive recruiting internship, which was basically 3 months of me like slogging through internet research. But it led to a year-long contract doing communications for World Vision up in Washington State. So that's kind of the fun part of being fun in quotes, but also in reality. The fun part of being a creative or doing something that maybe doesn't have as linear of a path is that you kind of end up stitching together some random pieces of work. So I had worked for NCM briefly in between those two World Vision things as like an interim social media person. And I'd written some articles for the magazine. And so then once my contract at World Vision ended, they called and said, hey, we want you to work for us. So it was it's kind of neat to see how all of those things wove together. So for that job at Nazarene Compassionate Ministries, I've been in that job for about 4 years in varying levels of responsibility. So as I mentioned, now I'm the general writer and editor for NCM Magazine, and then whatever other writing happens to come out of the organization. So I started as the editor in 2018, and in that role, I've had the chance to travel domestically and internationally. So it's really fun. I have gotten to go to 7 different countries for NCM stories so far. So from when I started in that position till now, I doubled my country count. So it's been a really neat experience, and it's taught me so much. If you ever want to simultaneously cringe and feel very motivated to get better, transcribe your own audio interviews, because there have been so many times when I've like mentally yelled at my past self saying, don't interrupt right there. But all of that has definitely helped me get better and grow in the position. So those international stories that I've gotten to cover are, one was water, sanitation, and hygiene, which we call WASH, anti-human trafficking, public health initiatives, immigration, and then food security. So those have been really neat experiences and definitely have taught me so much just about my own paradigms and how to write partnering with other people. So a little bit of background about NCM. It's the humanitarian aid and compassionate arm of the Church of Nazarene. So that means that we do all sorts of projects that are church-led and that highlight the inherent dignity of all people that everyone has as children of God. So the programs are holistic. So they ideally address not just here's some food, but how can we make this a long-term project that will change the community for the future and make long-term change. They also are, a lot of them are child focused. We have a really big child sponsorship program, and they're community based. So it's the idea that communities are going to know their needs best because they're the ones who are already there doing the work. So that's why we work through local churches and allow people who are in the country and in the field to inform those projects and then bring in kind of the expertise from NCM and the experience and history there. So some examples of those programs that we support are, as I mentioned, anti-human trafficking, food security, clean water, sanitation and hygiene, economic development, immigration and refugee support, women and girls. So we really do all sorts of different things. So it's fun for me because I get to then learn about each of those different things and write the stories about them. So NCM essentially exists to mobilize local churches or the local Church of the Nazarene to live out compassion in their communities. So a good example of that is the Shechem Children's Home in the Philippines, which is a project that PLNU has been instrumental in supporting, actually. So that's kind of a cool collaboration. Last year, PLNU made the Shechem Children's Home the recipient of the Lenten fundraising campaign. So it's neat to see how these projects really connect people from all over the world. You know, you could be on opposite sides of the globe and you're still being connected through these projects and these stories. So the way that the Shechem Children's Home came about is that the Church of the Nazarene in the Philippines wanted to start a project that addressed the online sexual exploitation of children. And so they had this idea to create an assessment center and a home where children could come for not too long. I think 3 months is kind of the average, and receive support for all sorts of different things. So educational, spiritual, they do counseling and therapy, and they work with a social worker. And then during those 3 months, the idea is that the children are able to, the staff of the house are able to kind of analyze and decide what the best next step is for the children. So the Church of the Nazarene in the Philippines had this idea, and then NCM was able to come in and speak from our experience with anti-human trafficking and support that project. So that's kind of how that usually happens, is that a church or the Church of the Nazarene in the country will submit a proposal and then work together with NCM. So that's kind of the basics of how NCM functions. So since the pandemic started, for me, I already work from home. I work remotely, so it sort of didn't affect that all that much. The main thing that was impacted was my ability to travel. So for example, in a pre-COVID world, I was actually supposed to be in London today. I think today would have been my last day in London after a trip to Kenya that I was going to make to learn about some community-based health initiatives and things like that. So part of what makes NCM cool is that me being there, those programs are not contingent on me being there. So NCM is super uniquely positioned to be able to continue these projects and start new ones because it is church-based, since it is community-based. So my US-based coworkers and I don't have to travel in order for people to care for people. We don't have to be there on the ground. And so there's NCM leadership in countries all over the world who are there and able to equip and enable projects through local churches. And they're right there in the communities. So that has been kind of a neat product of NCM's model, is that we were able to immediately start mobilizing local churches to respond to the pandemic. So since March, NCM has more than, I believe the number is 170 new projects in 81 countries. And those projects are serving more than 360,000 people. And they're involving more than 5,300 churches across 325 districts. So that's kind of the scale that the COVID-19 response has had. It's just all of these churches and all of these districts who are working together to say, what are the needs in the community and how can we be a part of that? So, and I didn't say this at the beginning, but if you have questions as we go, feel free to type them into the chat box, and I'll either answer them right then or we'll have time at the end for questions too. So some of the COVID projects that NCM has supported are a lot of them are food-based, because with the economic toll of the pandemic, there has just been a lot of issues with food security, where people aren't able to work and there isn't a safety net, and so people aren't able to get the food that they need. So I was going to highlight 3 different projects for you guys. The first one is in Albania, and Chelsea, if you want to flip to that first photo, so that people can see it. So in Albania, they experienced a high magnitude earthquake in November of last year. So that rendered a lot of buildings really unsafe and took a huge toll on the economy. So when the pandemic started, they were already recovering from this other emergency and this other disaster, because they really weren't that far apart. The earthquake was in November, and then if you say the pandemic started in March, that's really not a lot of time for recovery. And so you can see in this picture, it's just bags and bags of food. One of the things they started doing when the church leaders started wondering what to do was to just ask the community what people needed, and people said food. And so they started getting together these food packs, and Chelsea, you can go to the next picture if you want, to give out to people and distribute. And they did it, you know, with safe practices, and they have continued doing that throughout throughout the pandemic. So one church in particular has a child development center, which is a center where children can get educational support, emotional and social care, spiritual guidance, nutrition. And so without those centers being able to meet in person, a lot of the children weren't able to have the same nutrition that they would have had in a pre-pandemic world. So they started to reach out specifically to the families of the children who attend that center, and work with them to make sure that they had enough food. So one of the pastors in the churches said that one mother told them that they hadn't eaten anything for 3 days before they got the food from the church. So it's really important what they're doing on just a physical nutritional level. And they've been working with other organizations and the church, other churches and the government to kind of join forces. So if you want to go to the next picture, we can, these kind of just give an idea of what it looks like. So these are some of the church workers. And then if you go to the last one there too. So they're practicing some socially distanced, physically distanced greetings there. So one of the people who was involved is a Nazarene missionary. And I was just going to read out a quote from him from an interview that I did. So he said, "In seeing that this issue is affecting the entire world, and in knowing how people in Albania are still adjusting to new life after the earthquake, hopelessness and desperation are so evident. And in hearing the hopelessness that people have, we know that we have a hope that everyone needs." And so that's kind of the way that the church there has been functioning, is saying we have this hope and we have this food, and we are able to feed people spiritually and literally. And so what they're doing there is just really cool too. And they mobilized right away. Their project proposal was submitted within the first couple weeks of March, I think. So they really jumped to action to care for people in the communities and ask them what they needed. The second story that I was going to highlight is from Liberia. So Liberia is in West Africa, and thanks, Chelsea. They weathered the Ebola epidemic from 2014 to 2016. And on the one hand, people have experience because they have already made it through a health crisis. But on the other hand, they just made it through a health crisis, and this really bad one, extremely terrible sickness that caused a lot of death. But instead of becoming overwhelmed, the churches there really jumped to action, and more than 50 churches set up hand washing stations, which I think if you go to the next picture, it shows an example of what that might look like. at community points where a lot of people might be gathering. And many also started awareness campaigns where small groups would kind of go out to these community gathering places and teach people, kind of reiterate good hygiene techniques and talk about physical distancing and things like that. So they really have used what they learned during the Ebola epidemic to inform how they're responding now. One project in particular in Liberia is called the Empowering Women with Dignity Project. And women participate in these classes at churches to learn vocational skills like sewing, baking, soap making, and then with those skills, they start small businesses. So this has been a project that's been going on for years. It's a fantastic project. It's really cool. And the women who are involved with it they decided they wanted to help. They wanted to do something in the community when the pandemic started. And so they started distributing soap and face masks to the community. So if you go to the next picture, and they were able to distribute those to more than 150 families right away. And those numbers are from last month. So I think that they're probably even higher now. And then if you want to go to the last picture, I want to tell you the story of this woman. So she was a student in one of those classes. She's the mother of 3 children who are 8, 13, and 17. Her name is Sao. And her husband lost his job right before the pandemic started. And she and her family were going to be in dire straits without any sort of income and without, the normal avenues to earn income. And so she used the skills that she had learned in her class to make food items that then she and her children would go out and sell. So even with an early 3 p.m. curfew, they regularly sold out. And she says that she praises God because my family is safe from this epidemic and life is all right. And she also says that if it hadn't been for the vocational skills, that they easily could have starved and been in very dire straits. And so what's neat about that, and this is a great example of why these sorts of programs are important, is that programs like the Empowering Women with Dignity Project, they create resiliency and safety nets in places where there might not be any. So there isn't unemployment or any sort of safety net there. And these projects that are church-led and NCM supported are ideally creating the ability to have resiliency when bad things do happen. So then the final country that I was going to highlight is the Philippines. And churches in the Philippines have also, if you want to flip to the next photo, they've also really coordinated a response. So the churches there tend to be smaller, but they've organized food distributions for literally thousands of people and children. They've also given some cash assistance, which is, I don't know if you could say a new thing, but it's becoming more widely studied in humanitarian aid work because it helps stimulate the local economy as well. So we have more information about that in other places, but the Philippines had really strict lockdown rules. For a long time, only one person from a household could leave that household with a specific pass, or you would get arrested or fined really heavily. And I think that they, in the beginning, could only leave like once a week to go to the grocery store. The Philippines also has very high rates of poverty. So the churches had to get special permission, which they did, to care for those who, and walk with those who didn't have any source of income anymore once the lockdown started and no one was able to leave home. So the Nazarene Church in the Philippines also invests heavily in young people. And they did a similar thing to Albania, where they have a lot of holistic child development programming and centers. And they were able to reach out to those families directly and provide support, educational support, and continue that even though they weren't able to meet in person, as well as providing food to those families. They also wanted to care for the community at large, and so many churches also provided encouragement and food to frontline workers like police officers, doctors, and nurses. So it's really been a large-scale response that really has fed thousands of people. I forgot to have you change the photos. If you want to go to the next one, I got carried away in my story. So this is one of the food distributions at the church, where people could come and kind of get food staples that would last a long time. And then if you go to the next one. So they also would pray with people and just ask them about what else they needed beyond food, and kind of just try and converse and build those relationships together with everyone in the community. And then if you go to the final photo, we'll end on that one. So the NCM coordinator in the Philippines made it really clear that that compassion really comes from the love of Christ. This is at one of the child development centers. That's one of the children who regularly attend. And the NCM coordinator made it very clear that you can't have compassion without love. And so it's really encouraging and hope-bringing to see the scale of the programs that have started just from the ground up. And if you see a similarity between all these stories, I'm not surprised. As I mentioned, a lot of them are food distribution stories. And they're similar because the churches are looking around in their community and they're asking, what are the needs and what can we do? And then they're acting to feed those who are hungry and love those who are scared and be a present force of the love of Christ in their communities. And there are so many other stories I could share as well. So there's schools in the Middle East who have transitioned to online learning. There's a teenage girl in Guatemala gave up her birthday to give out food just because she felt moved to do so. There are churches who are providing mental health support in the UK. Like, there are stories from literally every world region. So these stories are COVID related. And then there are also so many stories that are not, of these projects that are going on all the time, that are building resiliency and highlighting dignity. So we're always trying to figure out what comes next, and listening and learning and figuring out how to do better and how to engage more. But that's kind of a highlight of some of the projects that have just started since March. And as I said, I think that there are close to 200 of those now that have been approved. And a lot of those are districts and churches working together. So that number, it includes many more than 200 churches and districts. So I don't know, Chelsea, if you want to open it up for questions.
Yeah, absolutely. If anybody does have any questions for Callie, we would love for you to put that in the chat. I think I would like to start one off. Callie, I've been kind of thinking through, I know that you said, the beauty is you don't have to be there, and so you've still been able to communicate and hear about these stories and talk about these stories. And I'm just curious if technology, like how that's played a part and what the access is in some of these places. I guess I would love for you to maybe share a little bit about that.
Yeah, definitely. And I should explain, I made it sound a little bit like we don't have a purpose. So it is definitely useful to get to be there, but it's nice that we don't have to be. So technology has definitely been a huge part of that, especially WhatsApp. We work with WhatsApp all the time. So there are always, anytime there's a disaster, we get on these WhatsApp threads and are able to learn right away pretty much what are people seeing there, what's going on the ground, how are people engaging, what are the needs. And so it's cool to see how technology has connected everyone and made it possible to learn about those things, not quite in real time always, but pretty close. So we have been lucky that over the past several years, we've been trying to kind of cultivate those communication streams, so that now it's even easier to learn about these stories that are going on, that I shared.
And then maybe another question I might have is, I know that Nazarene Compassionate Ministries has partnered with Point Loma for a few things, and would love to kind of hear about what that is. And I know maybe working with students in some capacity. Can you share a little bit about that?
Yeah, so I see Brian Becker on this call. He would probably be able to answer it even better. But so one of the things that I mentioned is the Shechem Children's Home, which Point Loma very generously supported and made part of the Lenten Giving campaign. And so that has been, that was a really cool partnership that happened. That was Point Loma driven, that they pursued with us. So that was cool to be able to work together on that. And then we've also done some work with trying to figure out what a border response looks like, especially a few years ago, where you know, the caravans that were coming up were in the news a little bit more, and figuring out. We also partnered with First Church, San Diego First Church at that time, to kind of just mobilize supplies. And since I live in San Diego, I was able to go down with Lily, who's also on this call, and a couple other people, to just try and figure out how do we partner with the churches in Mexico as well. So those are a few examples. So it looks like Kimberly asked, where is NCM getting the funding for these new COVID-related projects? And are there ways that we can all get involved? So the way that NCM funding works is pretty cool. We kind of have these buckets of funding that are available. We do a ton of fundraising. NCM is very much supported by people like you guys. And then that money is available for when something like this happens. So a lot of the money right now, I think, is getting pulled out of our emergency relief bucket. And then there's also real-time funding coming in to make those projects possible. So the Church of the Nazarene and individuals both very much help NCM projects happen, which is really cool. Ways you can all get involved. Do you mean practical ways, or like what can you do? I'll say both. One, you can support the projects for sure if you want to donate, but you can also get involved on a community level. So find out what's going on we're always trying to encourage people, find out what's going on in your local community. So and then find the thing that really speaks to you. So if you are really inspired or really touched by a specific story, start looking up, okay, what are the anti-human trafficking projects in my community? What are those programs in San Diego? How can I support those? Engage at a local level as well as the global level. So learn from NCM and get involved, and then also, get involved in your community. So then another question is, what is the role of collaboration with other NGOs? So I think that means, how do we work with other NGOs? We do that a lot. So for example, even the Shechem Children's Home, the International Justice Mission also funds that and helps with that. So we really like working with other NGOs because then you can share expertise and learn from each other, and you don't have to reinvent the wheel. So it's kind of project by project basis. We don't have like a big partnership with a certain NGO. It's kind of like, okay, so IJM is also working with anti-human trafficking and sexual exploitation in the Philippines. How can we join forces? So I think that answers the question. Kimberly asked, where can we read the stories you write? So the magazine is available at ncm.org/magazine. And then you can also read stories that I and one of my colleagues write on our blog, which is ncm.org/blog. Very clever name there. Okay, Brian asked, you shared the way NCM's compassion work is carried out by local churches and how this helps keep things grounded in communities and church life. Are there ever ways that this is this is a hard question, Brian, that this is a disadvantageous model in comparison to World Vision, etc., who have much more paid staff in the USA and around the world? I think anytime you're working with paid staff, you automatically have a level of accountability that you don't have when you're working with non-paid staff. So it's just, I think for me, and from a communication standpoint, it's harder to get stories when you don't have like a photographer who lives in the country that can send you pictures all the time. So a lot of times we're working with pictures that are sent through WhatsApp, which compresses them, that are taken like on a cell phone. So that's definitely a challenge from a communication standpoint. And I think that probably people who know a lot more about it than I could answer that question a little bit better in terms of from a programming standpoint. I could say something, you know, but since I work mostly in communications, I'm not sure I can answer that as well as someone else on my team might be able to. So another question is, can you talk more about where stories come from and how you determine what ends up in the magazine? Yeah, definitely. So we have been working on a system where every time someone submits a proposal or a report, it's compiled into this database that we have. And ideally, those reports are going to have a narrative component. And so then I can go through and check that and say, oh, that's super interesting, and then follow up on it. That happens like 30% of the time. So there's also the other 70% of the time where I work directly with communications folks in the countries, or with what we call our regional directors, who are the NCM kind of coordinators for the 6 world regions of the Church of the Nazarene. And so I can reach out to them and say, hey, I'm looking for a good story about clean water. Can you give me a contact in the country? And so kind of working your way from this person who's in charge of the region to the person who's in charge of the country to the NCM coordinator who specifically works with that project. And then determining what ends up in the magazine. I like to give a fairly broad scope of the work of NCM in the magazine. And so usually what I'll do for each magazine is look at what kinds of stories were in the previous magazines, what topics. We have 10 program areas that we kind of break everything down into. So which of those program areas did it cover? And then kind of try and find things that are covering new ground. But I also like to just tell good stories. And so figuring out what are those stories that people are really going to relate to, that are really going to speak to people, and just share good work. So again, that kind of figuring out what good stories are, Point Loma definitely helped me hone through roles and as a features editor, and then even just creative writing, figuring out what those narratives are that are really going to hit people. So Brian asks, a longtime work from home employee, do you have any advice for those of us who are new to it in COVID? I've had a lot of friends ask me the same question. I think for me, it took me probably a year to figure out that sticking to a schedule is super important, which is what a lot of people have been saying. But I used to kind of say like, oh, I'll just start work whenever I feel like in the morning and then work for 8 hours. But that actually made it way harder. So saying, okay, I'm going to start work at 8 and end at 4. It also helps like coordinate with other people. If you're sticking to your schedule, we have lunch at the same time every day. It just helps me kind of get in the right headspace. And then similarly, one of my biggest pieces of advice is to have a closed down schedule at the end of the day. Because if you're working in your living room, as I am, your work could easily bleed into the rest of your life. And so I learned this from a podcast, actually, to have a closed down ritual so that you can go into deep work while you're working and then be done. So I will go through this whole thing where I turn off my keyboard, I turn off my mouse. I have an old-fashioned secretary desk, so I can literally close my desk and it's gone. But my mom is a teacher, and she was asking for some advice when they had to transition to working from home, and I told her that, and she started covering her workspace at the end of every day with like a piece of fabric or something. And it's amazing how much of a difference even that, small amount of physical separation makes. So those are my 2 pieces of advice.
That is much appreciated. I know we are all in this new boat here. I'm at my dining room table, so. Well, Callie, thank you so much. I haven't seen any more questions come in, so I think this is probably a good time to conclude. We are just so appreciative of the time you took to give us this insight. I think this is some really, really great information and some good takeaways for how we can get involved at the community level as well. So again, just thank you so much for your time, and thank you all for joining us today. And being involved in, hearing about what's going on in the world, and how Point Loma has played a part and how our alums have played a part. This has been a really cool series. We would invite all of you to join us again next week. We'll be doing a partnership with our Center for Justice and Reconciliation on the Point Loma campus, and we'll be hearing, they're just inviting us to come into this conversation about racial justice, and we'll also be hearing from 2 alums who will talk about their experience in bringing their individual voices into that conversation as well. So hope that you'll also join us next week. Thank you all for being here. Have a great rest of your Wednesday. Get some lunch. Thank you, Callie. This was really, really awesome. So appreciate it. So. Have a great day, everyone.
Thanks so much for having me.